How to select materials or products for RSL testing. In this video, we will discuss selecting a lab for RSL testing, selecting a testing protocol, selecting raw materials or finished products, material-specific guidance, and packing and shipping samples. First, let us talk about selecting the right lab. There are multiple labs that can do RSL testing, so you need to consider the following. Location. Is the lab close to your facility so that transport is fast and convenient? Service speed. Understand how long the lab will take to do all the tests you need. Testing capabilities. Make sure the lab can do all the tests using the correct test methods. You could also look at the lab's ISO certifications to make sure their work is of a high standard. Communication. Make sure this is clear and fast. Test costs. These should be agreed on before you start, and you need to make sure you can pay conveniently. Next, let us talk about selecting a test protocol. There are multiple restricted substance lists used by brands around the world. In this video, we will be using the Affirm Group RSL. This is because it covers worldwide legislation and is agreed to by Affirm member brands. These include most of the leading brands in the apparel and footwear industry. The Affirm RSL has a test matrix that provides guidance as to what chemicals are likely to be found in which types of materials. There is a separate video on understanding the Affirm RSL. But for this video, we need to know that there are multiple materials covered by this RSL. Now, let us talk about selecting a sample for RSL testing. There are generally two types of samples. Input materials, such as fabric, buttons, zippers, thread, inks, leather, etc. Or you can have finished goods such as shirts, dresses, belts, shoes, hats, bed sheets, etc. Let us first talk about input materials. There are a few things to keep in mind when selecting these materials for RSL testing. First, it is important to select production-ready materials. These are materials made specifically for the production of finished goods, so you should not choose research and development materials, or materials that have gone through additional process steps, including chemical or physical treatments, or materials that have been in a warehouse for a long time. This is necessary to make sure the RSL test applies to the same material as will be used in the finished good. Next, you need to properly identify the type of material. For example, fabric can either be natural, like cotton, or synthetic, like polyester. Leather can be either from an animal or artificial. Zippers can either be made out of metal or plastic. Identifying the correct category of material will help the lab do the right test on the material. Sometimes a factory makes multiple materials but cannot test them all because of high testing costs. In this case, you need to select a few materials, and there are a few possible approaches. For example, you can consider testing the materials that are used for kids' products. In many cases, the limits are stricter for kids' products, so testing these materials ensures that you meet the strictest standards, and the final customer can be confident in all materials from your factory. You could also choose materials that have special treatments, such as waterproofing, reflective coatings, or fluorescent colors. These materials will have additional chemistries, so testing them will show that both the base material and the additional chemistries meet the RSL requirements. In some cases, when a supplier has multiple materials, it might be most efficient to test the highest volume materials. These materials will be used to make the most products, so it makes sense to ensure that they meet the RSL requirements. You could also choose newly developed materials because these will not have been tested before. Finally, some brands allow the testing of multiple materials in a single test. In this case, the materials will have to be homogenized. This way, the test sample will have an equal amount of each material in it. Some brands ask the labs to do the homogenization, so please check with your brand for guidance. Each brand may have their own requirements as to how materials are chosen, so please check with the brand to make sure you are choosing materials correctly. Now, let us look at specific guidance for some material types. Leather from animal hides is an interesting material. The edges of this material can have a different chemical composition to the middle, so the recommendation is to take an RSL sample from the middle of the material. This is also the part most likely to be used to make product. It is recommended to send 2 A4 pieces or 20 grams of material for testing. Textiles are sold and transported in rolls. In this case, the outside of the roll can get contaminated with dust and dirt. So the recommendation here is to take the RSL sample from the inside of the roll. Once again, make sure to send 2 A4 pieces or 20 grams of material for testing. When sending plastic materials, the labs need at least 20 grams of sample. So if your material is small, like buttons, you might have to send many samples instead of a few. Please check with labs to make sure they have enough sample. When sending metal samples, it is important to have at least 5 grams of sample. However, when you need to test for nickel release, at least 4 pieces are needed. This test also takes several days and cannot be rushed, so plan for this extra time. Chemicals are reactive compounds, usually liquids or pastes. Some brands require these to be tested in their liquid form. In this case, make sure that the container is resistant to the chemical. The container should be free of any other chemicals to avoid contamination. Approximately 100 milliliters of the sample is required for testing. Make sure this is well sealed in the container. Please check all shipping procedures because there are several rules concerning transporting potentially dangerous chemicals. Keep this sample away from heat or UV light, as this can change the chemistry of the sample. Similar to chemicals, brands require inks and paints to be tested in a variety of ways. Please check with your brand if they need the inks and paints tested in a wet form or fully dried. You may also have to test a screen print strike-off. This is a sample of the final print and should be produced using the same procedure as the final product. This covers the testing of input materials. Now let us look at how to test finished goods. As we discussed with raw materials, RSL testing on finished goods should be done on production-ready materials. These are made using the same procedures and materials as the final product. Again, you can choose to focus on testing products made for children, products with special treatments or fluorescent colors, newly developed products, or high-volume products. Please remember to check with your brand for guidance. Another important consideration when testing finished goods is to correctly identify the components. For example, a shoe can be made out of a rubber sole, natural leather, and laces. If you are using the Affirm RSL, for example, the laces would be tested as synthetic fibers, but the tips of the laces would be considered plastics. As you can see, some products can be very complex with many material types. Please communicate these details to the testing lab. You also need to check with the lab to make sure they have enough sample. For example, the laces from one pair of shoes could be less than 20 grams. If you are not testing according to a specific brand RSL, each region may have specific requirements. It will be helpful to communicate this to the lab. The Affirm RSL is a good resource as it considers worldwide legislation. Please remember to also check with your brand if they have additional or specific requirements. You are now ready to send the samples to the lab. At this stage, it is important to pack the samples carefully. The following can affect the samples, so be careful about where they are stored. Temperature, especially high heat. Humidity, especially for leather samples. Light, especially strong UV light. Environment. This can include the exhaust fumes of vehicles or equipment. And cross-contamination. This is when 2 samples are placed next to each other and one can contaminate the other. Once the samples are packed and sent to the lab, there are a few other things to take care of. Firstly, do not ship your products to the customer yet. You need to hold the materials until the test is complete. Communicate with the lab to make sure they have all the information they need. They can also tell you how long the test will take. Once you get a pass result from the lab, you can release the materials or products. Now you can ship them to the customer. Make sure you keep records of the RSL tests in case the customer needs them in the future. This concludes the video presentation. We hope this has helped you understand what to consider in selecting an RSL testing lab, selecting an appropriate test protocol, how to select input materials and final products for RSL testing, how certain materials should be sampled and tested, how to pack and ship samples. Remember that the Affirm Group's RSL is free to access and use and is available in 5 languages.